I started school in September 1953 in the first grade at Jefferson Elementary School, which is on 4th and Commerce. And in those days, we didn't know any difference. We knew we went to a black school and white kids went to white schools. And, you know, we had our times, great times, and we never knew any difference, really, you know, because we had places we went and we had our own recreation center and they had their own recreation center.
When I was a little girl, I knew that there were things and places that African Americans were not welcome, and we handled that because our parents didn't argue about it. They just directed us in the proper channels. They knew where we were welcome to go, and so we followed those directions. For example, I lived very near to the totally African American school, and that was all I knew. And as I became older and well-read, I began to learn there were other opportunities I should be participating in, and then I became curious and moved in other directions.
The public ought to know that in the opinion of many lawyers who have studied this question, legal efforts to prevent integration can stand only a few years, probably not more than 2 or 3. The Supreme Court clearly stated that obvious efforts to circumvent the law would not be permitted. What is more, the public should be informed that if Section 141 is amended and the door thereby opened for the abandonment of our public schools wherever sentiment or passion may dictate, one thing is bound to follow as sure as night follows sunset. Many thousands of our less favored people, white as well as Negro, are going to be left out in the cold. Even if many white people are able, by means of makeshift private schools, to give their children a makeshift education, the chances are that countless others, along with the vast majority of our Negro people, will not be able, either for lack of space or lack of money, to do even that. What we shall have, in short, will be a backward march toward illiteracy, inefficiency, and mounting despair.
There were laws that were being developed that were limiting the degree to which you could educate people, in African American people. The amount of money that is being allocated to a black school is largely the most prohibitive thing that you could think of, because the quality of education in that regard, the teachers are not being paid the same amount. The administrators are both teachers and administrators, where in white schools you have administrators who don't teach. So the burden of educating students is greater.
There are more than 25 counties in the section where I live, and 1 or 2 cities where the white school population is less than 1/2. Faced with possible integration, this presents us in this section of Virginia with an insurmountable problem. May I say to you with all the sincerity that I possess, that enforced integration in Eastern Virginia will drive us to the extremity of closing some of our public schools, and possibly many of them. Make no mistake about that.
Massive resistance in the state of Virginia was something that occurred when the state legislators did not want white kids going to the same schools with black kids. And so you had some people in Richmond, Virginia, that spent a lot of time trying to figure out how can they put up roadblocks to the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. And so you had the governor, the state governor, who got behind wanting to make that happen. You had Senator Byrd, who also wanted to make that happen in the state of Virginia. And so you had the leaders in the state, the political leaders in the state of Virginia, saying, we do not want black kids going to school with white kids.
Well, how does it feel to be back in public school here at Lane?
Feels wonderful.
How about you?
Wonderful.
You're both juniors, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
How do you think you'll take integration here next year? Do you think you'll continue to go to school at Lane, or will you seek education elsewhere?
I think we'll have private schools next year.
How about you?
I think we'll have private schools.
You don't think you'll go here next year?
No.
Come next fall, do you anticipate that there may be further moves to keep Charlottesville schools desegregated, or you perhaps think you will go ahead, as you have said you will do, and desegregate Venable and Lane at least?
Well, there's no question in my mind that the schools will be desegregated next September. The city school board and the city council are committed to this procedure.
When schools finally integrated, and that happened in Charlottesville, actually in 1959, in September of 1959. The only two schools that, by the ruling of the judge, forced the schools to integrate were Venable Elementary School and Lane High School. And so you had 3 students who integrated at Lane High School, and you had 9 students who integrated at Venable Elementary. The other schools in the city of Charlottesville eventually integrated, but it wasn't, the city schools in general weren't fully integrated with all of their schools until 1966. My understanding with violent outbreaks, I think those occurred more in Richmond, in the Tidewater, Norfolk area. Interestingly enough, there wasn't a huge violent outbreak in Charlottesville, but there definitely were protests that occurred. The students who were mainly in the high school that integrated talked about stories where the racial slurs were yelled at them. They were mistreated by the adults, the teachers, and other adults in the building where they went to school. They had to sit together for safety. They were not allowed to do certain activities. They were just allowed to go to school. And so the protests that I think we're used to seeing from that time period, where you had the state police escorting children into different buildings, that didn't necessarily occur in that same fashion in Charlottesville, but you definitely had people who had to watch out for the children as they went into the building. They didn't have a line of police making sure they got safely into the building, but they definitely had to look out for their safety.
The times were very turbulent with that transition because the students had gone in first, integrated to schools, and then the teachers followed that. African American teachers went into the schools, and that was a very hard time for many people. Many students felt very, what was the word? Very, had a very difficult time with teachers.
Back in the 50s, of course, everyone wanted to be treated equally, and that meant making sure that you had access to everything that everyone in the country had the right to have access to, no matter your skin color. And so, so there were a number of people who fought very hard and thought it was very important for integration to happen. And there were some people who thought that integrating the schools would mean that black children would not get the attention and the level of education that they deserved because they would be in a school where they were not welcomed. And so there were some people who wanted to remain in desegregated schools. And then you have some people today thinking about the whole notion of the achievement gap. And why do we have the achievement gap? Well, we have the achievement gap, some people think, because you have teachers who don't believe in the children, in all of the children that they're teaching. And so, so they're not encouraged, they're not pushed, they're not challenged to perform to the level of their ability that they can perform because of the skin color. And so, again, you have some people thinking, well, if we had segregated schools, then you would have a staff of teachers who know how to work with children of color, who know what children of color need, and are there to make sure that they are as successful as much as possible. And so that ongoing confliction about segregation versus desegregation, and whether or not that was a positive thing for many in the African American community, still happens today.
Black kids that went to Lane and Venable, they had to do applications to go to those schools. No white parent did an application for their child to go to attend a Burley High School or Jefferson. And I just think that they missed so much. You know, originally in the state of Virginia, and I can't tell you about elementary schools, but there were approximately 115 black high schools in the state of Virginia. And now, out of the original black high schools, there are only 3 left that are high schools in the state of Virginia today: Armstrong and Richmond, I.C. Norcom and Portsmouth, and Booker T. Washington and Norfolk. Now they are all, some folks say integrated, but those are desegregated schools. But Burley was one of the first schools to close when they desegregated schools. In 1967, their doors were shut, 2 years after I graduated. Kids today have a lot of opportunities that kids did not have when I was coming along. But a lot of them do not take advantage of all the opportunities they have. And I've been to a lot of cities and during my time working for Amtrak, and some people said, and I kind of agree with them, that the worst thing that happened was during desegregation is that they closed up the black schools and forced black kids into white schools. And they should have kept the black schools open and put white kids into those schools.
I think as young people, it's important to learn from history in lots of different ways. The ages of the children who went through that long legal process back then, some as young as 6 years old, and some as old as 13 or 14, that I think it points to how resilient young people can be and how important it is to stand up for your rights, and how important it is to stand up for the rights of others so that we're all treated equally. And so to document their story and to be able to share that story with other young people, I think is very, very important. It speaks to how the history of the city of Charlottesville has had an impact on the rest of the country. There are some people who don't know that Virginia played a part in the Brown versus Board of Education case, that was a compilation of 5 different cases that were part of that final case against Topeka, Kansas. And so Virginia played a part in that. Thurgood Marshall and Oliver Hill came to Charlottesville for a number of integration cases. And so our young people need to know that Charlottesville played a big part in the history of integration, and not just in the state of Virginia, but across the country. And in learning from the mistakes that we've made in history and how we need to persevere, hopefully our young people will understand that we need those kinds of skills and to retain that kind of character as we move forward in thinking about the things we have to face as a country regarding integration and social and equitable justice.